Hey there! I am just about to take my car to get it tested for emissions and get my license plate and all my tags updated. And while I'm doing that, I thought I might talk to you a little bit more about Dante and Dante's Purgatorio. And the reason I'm doing it now is because it's hard to find time in my schedule. So, since I have to wait in line a lot for this, I thought this might be a good time to talk about Dante. This time, the first part of this week is about a pope, and it is also about the first part of the excessive love sins. And we also get to learn a few more things about how purgatory works. Starting with Canto 19, we're talking about the avaricious and the prodigal. Bum, 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 Purgatorio, bum, 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 bum. So the line here actually goes out of the inspection station and down around the block. So we're gonna be here for a while, which is great, because we have plenty of time to talk about Dante. So each week I've been talking about a resource I use to help me understand Dante a little bit better. And so this week I would like to say my very favorite resource of all is the resource of my students, because teaching intelligent students and listening to their discussion and listening to their brilliant questions always helps me to understand a text so much better. I mean, I've learned so much by teaching and so much by hearing just great comments and great questions. And so just the other day, being able to sit down with you, Harrison, and have a coffee and talk about Dante, that was so much fun, and I got so much out of that. So thank you so much. So when we left off last week, Dante was falling asleep, and he was in the middle of the slothful. And we talked about the organization of purgatory and the way it's all laid out, and the slothful who have too little love. They aren't willing to go for the good. And in that moment, Dante falls asleep. And there's some debate over whether this action is an act of sloth. After all, he's falling asleep in the middle of all of this, and then sort of inactively allowing his mind to absorb some of the ideas. But we saw by the language there, it really seems like his mind is actively working and then sort of processing it through sleep. And sleep is a kind of prophetic power in this book. Each time he sleeps, it's always in the morning hours, and he always has some great dream that shows him something about what is to come. And then afterwards he is shaken and wakened and moved on. So the same thing happens here. And this time, instead of an eagle, we see a dream of a siren. And it starts out with this hideous old woman who moves out into the picture, and she is stuttering, and her body is bent and shriveled and hideous. But in a moment, she suddenly sort of transforms and becomes this great beauty, this great alluring beauty. The siren stands in for the next three sins. These are the sins that come from appetite. They come from desiring something too much. The first one is avaricious, the one who desired money too much, and they abused their money. After that, we're going to look at the gluttons, and finally we're going to look at the lustful. Now, I haven't really mentioned this before, but it's been coming up. The Purgatory is organized opposite of Inferno. In fact, really everything in Purgatory is opposite of Inferno, isn't it? But the organization is opposite. We start with the worst and the deepest and the hardest sins to root out, the ones that truly are the most destructive, and we work backwards. We work to the lightest sins, as opposed to in Inferno, where we started with the more impulsive sins and we worked our way down to the more entrenched, willful sins. We're really going backwards here. And notice how Dante always talks about how the way gets easier the higher up you go. It's because we've shaken off the worst sins first, and now we are progressing forward into the lighter to the easier sins. I'd like to point out that when the siren transforms, it says it bloomed, her face bloomed as love would wish it for its delight. Tying it back to the idea of love that we've talked about so much in the last few cantos, and how very much that is what Purgatory is all about. It's all about love, and it's about the way that love can be manipulated in all the wrong ways. And the siren begins to sing, which is sort of what you'd expect from a siren, right? They sing and lure you off the path, but as she's singing, she talks about who she is and how she lured Ulysses away. And we return to the story of Ulysses. Now, we've referenced Ulysses a few times here in Purgatory, and that makes a lot of sense. Giuseppe Mazzato, one of my favorite discussers of Dante, he talks a lot about how he brings out these references to Ulysses and connects them back to the story of Ulysses in the Inferno. When Dante met Ulysses in the Inferno, he was this noble, epic hero, but who had gone wrong by putting things in the wrong order. If you remember back in the Inferno, he had said that knowledge brings virtue, when really that's not how it works. Just because you experience something doesn't make you a better person. And so he tempted his men into following him beyond the boundaries that had been set up for them. They broke the rules. They went too far. And so there was a lot of pride there, but there was also a lot of sort of inversion of ideas. Let's seek after knowledge, and through it we'll find wisdom and we'll find virtue, when those things don't really come from breaking the rules. Experience is a great teacher, but there's some things that you just shouldn't have to experience in order to learn. But we also saw that Ulysses was the one who sailed around to the other side of the world and saw Mount Purgatory. He saw it from a distance, and there's something admirable about that, even though he went about it the wrong way. And now Dante is kind of following in his footsteps, but he's doing it in a permissible way. He's doing it according to the rules, according to heaven, and heaven is guiding him through this. And so because of that, he's being blessed in his journey, as opposed to Ulysses, who is doing it of his own will and of his own volition, which led him to destruction. Here again, we see the temptations that remind us of how Ulysses was tempted and ultimately went astray. And Dante has been tempted again and again, but he is choosing to do the right thing, and he's being guided towards the right. So this heavenly lady asked Virgil to unmask the siren, so to speak, to stop this charade that she's putting on. The heavenly lady is unclear. It could be Beatrice, but it's not necessarily defined. And Virgil seizes the witch, and with one rip laid bare all her front, her loins, and her foul belly. I woke sick with the stench that rose from there. So that fake beauty that she was wearing is torn off by Virgil. And so here again we see, is this prophecy? Well, it is sort of setting up the next three sins, these sins of allurement, the sins of excessive love, but it also sort of mirrors the entire story, because Dante was going astray. A heavenly lady sent to Virgil to guide him and rescue him and put him back on the path. To some extent, this sort of mirrors the entire story. After all, it was the she-wolf, who is referenced here again, from the Inferno, the one who he had the most difficulty avoiding in the Inferno, that is connected with the siren. As he wakes up, Virgil says, "Hey, I called you 3 times already. It's time to go on." And of course, 3 is still symbolic. And so they progress forward, but Dante's really struggling with this vision and what it means and what he needs to do about it. And so he's concentrated and he's focused. It says, his brow was as drawn as is a man's, so bowed with thought he bends like half an arch of a bridge. So he's bowed over with his care about this sign that he saw. They pass the angel for the slothful, and they ascend up to the next cornice, and the angel, of course, wipes off the pee and sings the beatitude for this section, which is, "Blessed are they that mourn." And Virgil asks him, "So what's wrong? What's going on?" And he mentions that he's still thinking about his dream and that he saw and what it means. And Virgil sums up and explains. He says, "Did you see that ageless witch?" he said, "for whom and for no other those above us weep. And did you see how men escape her doom? Let it teach your heels to scorn the earth, your eyes to turn to the high lure the eternal king spins with his mighty spheres across the skies." So again, she's carefully defined as the temptations that they're just about to see, these next 3 sins on the next 3 cornices. And also, Virgil reiterates the ideas that we've been exploring in depth in the last few cantos, the idea that there are 2 kinds of focus, there's 2 kinds of love. There's that one that comes from above, that eternal love, and then there's the more earthly love, and both are good, but if you keep the eternal love in focus, everything else falls into place. It's when you get excessively into the earthly loves, like food or money or physical pleasure, that you are led to destruction. And after Virgil sort of clarifies this and brushes it off for him, notice what happens. Dante suddenly starts to his feet and gets going. And as he does so, it says here that he is filled with desire. Again, everything is about the loves, the desires, the things that you seek after. And now Dante is filled with desire for eternal things, and so his feet are quickened, and he's able to move ahead and do what's right. And so we move up to the next cornice, the 5th cornice. And here we see souls stretched out lying on their faces. These are the avaricious, which remind us again of the avaricious back in Inferno. And just like in the Inferno, they are coupled with the prodigal. So we have two kinds of people here. People who held on tightly to their wealth and wouldn't spend any of it. And we have people who threw their money around like crazy, shopaholics. Both of these are negative behaviors with wealth. And in the Inferno, we saw how both these behaviors are an attempt to control fate, to control fortune, to Lady Fortune, your luck. And so you're trying to control Fortune's wheel, and the souls in Inferno were pushing these great weights around and smashing into each other back and forth as if they could control the rotation of Fortune's wheel in their own favor. Here, instead, they are lying on their faces in the dust because now they realize what a very hollow and empty pursuit that is. And so they're face down in the dust in the way that they realized that their pursuits were they were only seeking after dust, and what they were really hanging on to was meaningless and pointless. And in fact, their prayer here is, "My soul cleaves to the dust," just as we've seen each of these souls are praying in their punishment as they attempt to be purged of their sins. And as usual, Virgil asks for directions, as always, and it's always to the right, but also here we get a little bit more of the workings of Purgatory and how it functions. We see that you don't have to be punished for every single type of sin before you're completely purged, just the ones that really were your problem. You might also be punished for more than one, so you might spend some time in pride, move on to envy, we've already seen that, and you spend the ordinate amount of time, but there are some sins that may not affect you at all. And so when the souls say, oh, if you're not punished by this particular sin, if this isn't one of yours, then you just move on up to the right. And Dante, as usual, wants to talk to one of the souls, and so he actually asked this soul, kind of interestingly, if you can put off your purging for a little while and talk to me, and then you can get back to it afterwards. He says, "O soul in whom these tears prepare that without which no soul can turn to God," the purging, right? "Put off a while, I beg, your greater care, and tell me who you are and why you lie prone, and if there is some way that I may serve you in the world I left while still in flesh and bone." Same sort of request as before. Is there anyone I can get to pray for you to help you out? But also notice how he says, "Put off a while your greater care," which is connected perhaps to the idea of the greater love. So put off the greater good for just a little while so that you can serve this other good, which is helping yourself by helping me. And this soul is Adrian V, and he speaks to Dante for a moment, and we realize he is a pope. How cool is that? And oh, wait a second. If we look back in the Inferno in Canto 19, which we're in Canto 19 of Purgatorio, we talk to a pope there too. And so we see something about the popes and about the papacy and about the church leadership in both that section of Inferno and also this section of Purgatorio. We passed! Yay! Now on to tags. So I'm at the Department of Motor Vehicles and about to go get my tags. But before I do, let's finish Canto 19. So as I was saying, this section mirrors the section in Inferno. There we talked to Pope Nicholas III, and we talked a lot about Pope Boniface VIII, and here we talked to Adrian V. And there's a huge contrast between these two. In the Inferno, we were talking about the sin of simony, that abuse of religious things for one's own gain. And we saw how very abusive those particular popes were, how they used their position as pope to seek after power, to seek after wealth, and how that just led to horrible consequences. Well, here we see quite the opposite. Adrian V was avaricious. That means he was greedy. He was already seeking after wealth. But it was actually taking on the papal mantle, taking on the position of pope, that woke him up to his own greed and to the danger of his greed, and actually turned him around. So instead of taking that position and using that position to seek after greedy things, to seek after wealth, to seek after power, he actually was corrected by that position. He was actually reformed because of that. And so ultimately, he's the first pope that Dante's mentioned who's going to ultimately get to heaven. The rest of them have been spiraling downward into eternal damnation. I find that fascinating. Also here is the first time in Purgatory where we've really seen the contrapasso laid out in great description and detail by one of the sinners. And this reminds me very distinctly of the time when we met Bertrand de Born in the Inferno. He was among the schismatics, if you remember. He had his head off. Listen to this. The nature of avarice is here made plain in the nature of its penalty. There is not a harsher forfeit paid on the whole mountain. That sure sounds almost exactly like what Bertrand de Born said, at least to me. In my own personal opinion. So I think, again, Dante is pointing out the idea of contrapasso, the idea of how the punishment fits the crime, how very carefully these are mirrored. And each time the person who's saying that always talks about how this is the worst of all. He talks about how because their eyes were so much on earthly things, now they're face down in the dirt, and because they weren't doing good works, they're clamped up, they're tied up and stuck here. And notice again the final point here, the fact that when Dante is kneeling beside Adrian V, realizing, hey, this is the Pope, I need to kneel before him, I need to show some respect for this guy. Look at what Adrian says. "Why do you lower your knees into the dust?" he said to me. "And my conscience troubled me for standing in the presence of your rank and dignity." Especially since Adrian has to lie on his face, so why should Dante stand in front of him? That doesn't seem right. This guy's the Pope. And look what he says. "Straighten your legs, my brother. Rise from error," he said. "I am, like you and all the others, a fellow servant of one emperor." So the emperor they serve is, of course, God. And he says, I am a fellow servant with you. I am the same as you. Dante puts popes on the same level as any other Christian. But notice how he still reveres the position of Pope. So it's the job of Pope that's very special and very sacred, yet the person of the Pope is no more special or sacred than anyone else. That person is a soul just like every other soul, and they all serve one emperor, God. This distinction is going to be played up a little bit more in the next canto, when we talk a bit more about abusing someone in the position of Pope, and what a very bad act that is. So skipping ahead just a little bit, after they talk to Hugh Capet in just a few minutes later, he talks about how one of his descendants is going to do something really, really horrible to the Pope. Some of his descendants actually captured and kidnapped Pope Boniface VIII and really abused him, drove him crazy, and then he died shortly after that. Pretty dramatic event. And even though Boniface VIII is about the worst pope Dante could ever imagine, and he really trashes Boniface throughout all the Inferno, you remember, and he talks about what a horrible, horrible man this is, he's still, when he talks about this act against Boniface VIII, calls it a second crucifixion of Christ, a second Pilate who washes his hands of this event. And so he points out how the abuse of Boniface VIII, he mirrors that with the crucifixion of Christ. How is Boniface VIII a Christ figure? After all, he's a scumbag, he's a horrible man, and yet he is, as Pope, standing in a very sacred position. So an abuse of someone who is the Pope is like abusing Christ. So, Dante really reveres the position, even if he thinks that the people who are in the position are simply human and still make mistakes. I'm gonna run in and get my tags, and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Now, before we get into Hugh and get too far into Canto 20, let's backtrack just a tiny bit to the end of Canto 19 and how that blends over into the beginning of Canto 20. So Canto 19 ends with Pope Adrian V actually asking Dante to go ahead and leave him alone. He says, "Now go your way, I wish to be alone. Your presence here distracts me from the tears that make me ready." Notice how that connects with the beginning of this section, how Dante says, could you pause seeking after the greater good for a moment and actually talk to me? And here he says, you're distracting me from my true purpose, which is to be purged, so go ahead and leave me alone here. So that brings us to the beginning of Canto 20, where Dante responds to this idea by saying, what's willed must bow to what is stronger willed. Against my pleasure, to please him, I drew my sponge back from the water still unfilled. So Dante would have liked to continue this conversation, but he cuts it off. He draws back his sponge unfilled because his will, his desire, is secondary to Pope Adrian's desire. And so again, we tie back into that image, that idea of desires, good desires and better desires. What's willed and what's the greater purpose. And so here Dante wishes to be able to continue this conversation, but he realizes that more important is Adrian's continuation towards perfection and his ultimate arrival in heaven. And anything that's holding him back from that is not good. Even if it is a kind of good, it's not the greater good. And so sometimes here we have to put aside good things to really get the best things. And that idea shows up again and again and again in Purgatory, all the way back to the beginning. Remember when they were singing and how great their songs were and how much they were enjoying their little song fest there at the bottom of the mountain? And Cato runs up to them and reminds them, you've got to move forward. Purgatory is all about moving forward and seeking the very best and not being distracted by things that can be good, but ultimately seeking the very greatest things. So Dante continues on, and as he does, he notices how very, very crowded this cornice is. There's so many people, it's really hard for Dante and Virgil to walk across it. It's very cluttered with all these souls lying face down. And so Dante's having a bit of trouble getting through it, and he points out how the she-wolf, these desirous sins, these excessive love sins, are really dangerous, and how they really have overwhelmed so many, many people. And all of a sudden, as they're walking along, they hear a voice, and it's of course Hugh Capet, as we've already mentioned, but this voice is giving the whip of avarice. You remember how each of these different cornices start with a whip and end with a rein? Well, this one's a little bit different. We've already been on the cornice for a whole canto, and we're finally coming to the whip. It's a little bit out of order. But we realize, through Hugo's explanation, that the souls, as they pray, which we've already heard them praying, my soul is in the dust, as they pray, they also issue out, according to their response to their purgation, their response to their punishment, they issue out the whip during the day and the rain at night. And so although we don't actually hear the rain, Hugo explains it to us. And the whip, as always, is a set of 3, the first one being to Mary. And it talks about the nativity and how Mary was so impoverished that she put the baby Jesus in the manger, and how that stable and that manger scene were really a symbol of humility and poverty, as opposed to the wealth that all these avaricious really sought after. We also have Fabricius and St. Nicholas, both mentioned here as examples of other people who did not concern themselves with wealth, or who gave great wealth away instead of seeking to cling to their wealth. And Dante questions him after hearing the whip, and Hugh Capet explains who he is, and he also talks about his lineage. And he talks about how the lineage of French kings that come from him all were very avaricious, and how their avariciousness led to all of these different problems in the kingdom. And ultimately he goes down through his line and talks about all of their faults, and then talks about the future, and talks about, as I've already mentioned, how one of his descendants is going to, has not yet, but is going to abuse Pope Boniface VIII. Of course, that happened in Dante's lifetime before he wrote the book, but after the time that the book is set. It's set in 1300 and not written for another 20 years. And Hugh goes on to explain how they all pray this whip and this rain throughout the day, and then throughout the night, the whip during the day and the rain at night. But Dante just happened to be walking by when Hugh was the one doing it. But they all do when they are moved to do it. And he goes on and he explains the rain of avarice, and he talks about lots of people who are destroyed by their greed and by their seeking after wealth and power. Achan, who's a story from the Bible, a man during the time of Joshua who hoarded some wealth, which caused great destruction on his people. Sapphira, another biblical story, some of the early church members who hoarded their wealth and pretended like they'd given it to the church when they hadn't. Midas and Pygmalion, although not the Pygmalion you know, another Pygmalion, both people who were led to destruction by their love of gold and their love of wealth. And so after they leave Hugh Capet, they begin to move forward, and it's exhausting. Dante said, "We were expending every ounce of strength on the remaining distance of the stairs. We were really working towards rising up and continuing on, when all of a sudden there's this horrible earthquake. I felt the mountain shake as if it tottered. Such a numb dread seized me, as a man feels when marching to the stake." And Virgil gives him comfort, although Virgil doesn't understand either. Virgil says, "Don't worry, I'm still here, I'm still your guide," even though they don't understand. And all of a sudden, all the souls around them begin to sing praise, "Glory to God in the highest." And they're all, Dante and Virgil are astonished, and then everything falls back to itself, falls back to normal. And then they continue on. But Dante is really confused. His mind is completely astonished by all of this. He says this is the most confusing thing he's ever experienced, and yet there are no answers to his questions, and he just has to continue on. And that's how we end Canto 20. So he's walking on in the midst of confusion and looking around for an answer, but there is no answer for him yet. Not till Canto 21. But before we talk about Canto 21, let's head on to my next errand, which is to drop some things off at Goodwill. Okay, so Canto 22 begins with Dante's discussion of his thirst for understanding. He heard that earthquake, and he's heard the song that went with it, and he wants to know why. He's really bothered by the fact that he doesn't understand. And he says, "The natural thirst that nothing satisfies except that water the Samaritan woman begged of our Lord, as St. John testifies, burned me. Haste drove me on the encumbered way behind my guide, and I was full of grief at the just price of pain those spirits pay." So, Dante himself feels the grief and pain of penance because he doesn't understand. And notice again that idea of thirst. This is from a story in the Bible in which Jesus speaks to a Samaritan woman, and they talk about the difference between physical thirst and spiritual thirst. And so again, we see two kinds of desire here. The desire for spiritual things versus physical desire. And Dante talks about that kind of idea connected with his own desire for knowledge. It's a desire for knowledge, but it's also a spiritual desire to understand more deeply the spiritual significance of what he's just heard. They're walking along with bowed heads so they don't step on anybody, but the bowed heads may also sort of represent their sorrow because they don't understand, they don't know what this means, when all of a sudden behind them appears a soul. This is Statius, and Statius is going to be very important throughout the rest of Purgatory. And Statius is confused at how they are here, particularly Virgil, since after all Virgil is not one of the saved souls. He's supposed to be back in limbo. And Virgil explains, again, as many times before, the process through which they have gone in order to get here. And he points out that Dante is actually going to be saved ultimately, and points out the marks that the angel left on his forehead and what those are for. And he asks the question that's been eating at both of them for a while. "But tell me, if you can, what was the shock we felt just now? And why did all the mountain cry with one voice down to its last moist rock?" This is from Chardy's translation, and Chardy goes to great depths to point out in his explanation in his notes that he couldn't make this line work without kind of manipulating it a little bit. There's no rocks on the shore of Purgatory. It's down to the base of the mountain, to the muddy base at the water's edge, and he apologizes for that, which makes me appreciate him as a translator very much. And Statius points out how this earthquake happened. And first he starts out by negating the fact that earthquakes can happen in Purgatory for any natural means. In fact, once you get to the gate of Purgatory, after you start the actual ascent onto the cornices, You are no longer affected by any weather whatsoever. You've moved into a spiritual kind of realm. Although you're still connected to Earth, you've moved up into a spiritual plane. And so we see again, as we have seen before, that Purgatory is a place of transition. We've moved beyond the world, beyond some of the influences of the world, and yet we're still on Earth. So where did that earthquake come from if it didn't come from natural sequence and natural weather? Statius says, "It trembles here whenever a soul feels so healed and purified that it gets up or moves to climb. And then the great hymn peals. The soul, surprised, becomes entirely free to change its cloister, moved by its own will, which is its only proof of purity. Before purgation, it does not wish to climb, but the will high justice sets against that wish, moves it to will pain, as it once willed crime." I think this is another connection to a very fascinating idea. Not unlike in Inferno, where every section was connected to a guardian who watched over and helped to torment the souls down there. In Purgatory, the souls are not held externally, they're held by will. Their own will is submitted to the higher will, the will of heaven. And the will of heaven is what keeps them here, keeps them in their punishment until they've done enough. And then they're freed, and suddenly their will wakes up the desire within them to move upward and to ascend into greater heights. And we see that sometimes that means moving up to the next cornice and paying for the next sin you've got, but ultimately there is a moment when you have purged all of your sin and you are ready to ascend into heaven. And at that moment the mountain shakes and there is singing and the soul rises. And here Statius finally explains that he is the soul for which they are all singing. He has just been freed from his sins, and now he's going to ascend up to the heights. And he doesn't have to pay for the next two sins because they weren't his. And so he's ready just to go straight on to heaven. But we're also going to see that he's going to stall with them for a while. And again, we have that same idea of will again. Free will and where will gets you, which we've been repeating all the way through Inferno and now through Purgatory. Will and desire over and over and over again. And here, Dante finally wraps up his metaphor about thirst that he's repeated about 3 times throughout this canto. And now he talks about how refreshed he is and how after being very, very thirsty, the final drink is so much sweeter. And Virgil asks for this man's name, and he explains who he is, that he is Statius. And he talks about his own poetry. He is, of course, another poet. But in the middle of this, he begins to speak about his inspirations, and he starts talking about Virgil. Now, he doesn't know yet that he's talking to Virgil, and so unfolds a really comical and fun scene. He says, he's talking about the Aeneid, and he said, "Without it, I would not have weighed half a penny's worth. And to have lived back there in Virgil's time, I would agree to pass another year in the same banishment from which I climb." So Statius is talking about himself and his poetry, and he's like, "Oh, that Virgil, man, if I could only have lived when he lived, I would have spent more time being punished here, because he was just so awesome. I just love Virgil." And meanwhile, he's standing there with Virgil. Virgil, at these last words, shot me a glance that said, in silence, "Silence." But man's will is not supreme in every circumstance. So Dante fails to take control of his will in this circumstance, for tears and laughter come so close behind the passions they arise from that they least obey the will of the most honest mind. I did no more than half smile, but that shade still fell and looked at me in the eye. So we have this great moment where Virgil looks over at Dante and says, but Dante can't help it. He's like laughing into his hand because here's Statius going on, "Oh, I love Virgil. Virgil's so awesome." Statius wants to know, of course, why Dante's smirking over there. And so he asks him, and Dante says, "Oh, I'm not making fun of you. I'm sorry. It just..." And he looks at Virgil and he can't really explain, but Virgil says, "All right, fine, just go ahead and tell him." And so Dante says, "It's Virgil right there. You're talking to Virgil." And of course, Statius is overwhelmed. Hooray! It's one of those great moments when you are talking all about somebody, but you don't realize they're standing right next to you, and this guy just so happens to be like your greatest hero. And Statius, being so excited to see Virgil, kneels at his feet and embraces his knees, as we've seen before, a position, a posture of great reverence. And Statius, rising, said, "So may you find the measure of the love that warms me to you, when for it I lose all else from my mind." forgetting we are empty semblances and taking shadows to be substances. Giuseppe Mazzotta makes a big deal of all the failed embraces in this book. There are many times where a soul will try to embrace another soul. We saw that all the way back at the very beginning when Dante tried to embrace the soul of his former friend and found that his arms went right through him. But over and over again, there are these times when one soul will bow to another or will try to embrace another, and we realize that we've moved beyond that. We're all on the same path here, and those moments of reverence and of bowing and of embracing no longer exist. All of us instead should be looking forward. We should be looking in the same direction and looking toward ascent. And we're going to understand a little bit more next time why Statius loves Virgil so much. Of course, he admired his poetry, but there's a lot more to it than that. And Statius, as a character, is going to be very significant to us. But we'll save a discussion of who Statius is and why he's such an important symbol until next time. So, thanks so much for riding around with me on my errands and for helping me to discuss the Inferno, and I will see ya next time as we talk about Cantos 22 through 24. See ya.